Admiral James Stavridis, United States Navy retired, former Allied Supreme Commander of NATO, and a midshipman who I suppose has a rooting interest, but will give us an objective evaluation of the Navy-Army game this weekend. Admiral, what do you think's going to happen?
Well, I think on a scale that runs from the 1976, that's my class, 51 to nothing shellacking that we put on Army, to the other end of the scale would be Army improbably wins 4 in a row. I'm going to go in the middle and say it'll be a close game and Navy's going to win because we're 9-2 and they're like 4-7. And, you know, this really is America's game at the end of the day. And the only time these Army and Navy are at odds is on that gridiron. The rest of the time we are brothers and sisters in arms. But it'll be a great game. I'm going to predict Navy by 7, Hugh.
You beat, as a senior midshipman, 51 to nothing?
Well, Jim Stavridis, all 5'5", 136 pounds, did not participate on the field. But, however, I will point out I did score wins in varsity matches against Army in both squash and tennis, more my style.
You go.
But there's nothing like that football game, and I'm very proud of my classmates who were on the field and did take us to victory, 51 to nothing. You can look it up, as Yogi Berra would say.
Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about, we saw 3 ships come sailing in because it is the Christmas season and there are hundreds of ships at sea around the world, both the United States fleet and our allies. What are the holidays like at sea? Do you even notice?
What a great question. And yes, you do. And so there are, to put a number on it, there are probably 18,000 ships at sea. And military ships, I'd estimate a couple of thousand military ships out there, Hugh. And yes, you very much decorate up. Let me start with a couple things. On the bow of the ship, typically you'll see Santa Claus on a U.S. ship. You'll see maybe a reindeer up there. Up on the bridge, there'll be little tree. There'll be ornaments throughout. And the mess specialists, the cooks, if you will, really put on a feast. And it's turkeys and ham. And one of the highlights of my year, every year as a commanding officer at sea, was to go down, it's kind of tradition, to carve the turkeys for the 400 people in the crew. You haven't lived until you've carved like hundreds of turkeys or so. But it is very much celebrated at sea. And by the way, it's an ecumenical holiday. We make sure we cover all the bases. But that Christmas mythology, Santa, reindeer, Christmas trees, a big feast, very much part of the scene. And you also kind of do what we call CQ holiday routine. You know, if you're not in combat operations or forward in the Gulf, but if you're just transiting, which you spend a lot of time doing, it's a pretty relaxed pace on the ship. You let people sleep in a bit. You show more movies on the ship's entertainment system, and people are in a pretty good mood. Everybody's sad to be away from their families, but you're in this together on a warship at sea. It's not a bad day at sea.
Now, talk to me a little bit, because they're voting in the United Kingdom today, and believe it or not, the future of England's nuclear navy is on the ballot. If Jeremy Corbyn wins, he does not want to replace their 4 Trident missile-carrying submarines with 4 new ones, which are supposed to deploy in the 2030s. Boris Johnson is committed to it, and to a second carrier, I believe. How important is the British fleet to the NATO fleet, to the American fleet?
Oh, it is crucial. And you know what, Hugh? It's not just the nuclear submarines, which you correctly point out. It's not just the 2 fully capable aircraft carriers, lead ship, the Queen Elizabeth. It's not just the high-end air defense system. It's not just the cyber capability. What the British fleet brings to NATO, and I'll say it candidly, to the U.S. Navy, is a standard of professionalism at sea that, in my view, is unmatched. They are just terrific seagoing operators. We work together constantly all over the world. Some of my closest friends remain either retired or active duty British admirals today. And so it would be an immense mistake or down check for NATO to see that kind of capability sort of drift away, no pun intended, from the rest of the NATO fleet. And for the record, I think that a nuclear capability for Britain is crucial if they intend to remain a global power and a member of the UN Security Council, crucial for them. So I hope I never take sides in a foreign election, but on policy and capability, God save the British fleet.
You know, I've read for years about Scapa Flow and the very famous things that have occurred there, including the scuttling, I think, of the German Navy and various maneuvers. Have you ever sailed in and out of that?
I have, and it's a very interesting body of water. And at the time, it was heavily mined defensively, which is always a little nerve-wracking. You never want to be around mines in the water driving a ship, even when you're told, "Hey, here's the laydown, here's what it looks like." But at the end of the day, the Brits, again, professionalism, manage it very capably. And it's very much a part of their history and their tradition.
Now, I want to go back to something new. The new National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, this past weekend at the Reagan Defense Forum, I don't know if you were there, Admiral Stavridis, or not, he said a 350-ship Navy means a 350-ship Navy and not decades from now. Acting Navy Secretary Modley came out and said, we're on board here, pardon the pun, and we're going to get it done. What do you make of all this?
I take it as a very positive step. And Tom Modley, I was in the Pentagon with him 10 days ago. I was with our new Chief of Naval Operations, also in the Pentagon, Admiral Mike Gilday, whom we've discussed before. Two absolutely terrific professionals, 100% focused on the Navy and our capabilities. And the acting secretary, Tom Modley, is behind the idea of let's get to I think he says 355 in a decade. That is a tall order and will require not only construction, but lengthening the length of time some of our ships have remained in service. It'll require perhaps activating some that are deactivated, but there are pathways to get there. Our mutual friend, Captain Jerry Hendricks, has spoken and written a great deal about this. So I think it's a step in the right direction. It's something I applaud the Trump administration. They've been consistent for it, and let's hope we'll see the follow-through as things go forward.
No, Admiral, I've been reading Robert Kaplan's Asia's Cauldron. It's about 4 or 5 years old, but what he does convey, perhaps better than the other books I've been reading, is the traffic density in the South China Sea. Can we really trust submersibles that are unmanned in such a heavily regulated waterway, such a terribly trafficked Narrows?
I would say we cannot today, but I'd flip the question, Hugh, and say, can we trust driverless cars in Manhattan with huge traffic density today? No. Can we trust them in 10 years? I think probably so, with advances in artificial intelligence driven by quantum computing, machine learning behind that. Flip that to the oceans, it's actually a much easier problem. And I think over time, we will be able to see a whole array of semi-submersibles running from Jules Verne-like creations that are transit kind of platforms to energy recharging stations to surveillance platforms to attack platforms. I'll close by saying the simpler the mission, the easier it is to do that semi-submersible piece, even in that incredible land of traffic density. By the way, I just want to underline Robert Kaplan's Asia's Cauldron, which is extremely readable. It's a short, tight look at all the nations around the South China Sea, and like you, I commend it.
No, it's a terrific book to listen to, too, because I'm learning so much. One thing that surprised me, his assertion, I wanted to test it with you, that the PRC's diesel-operated submarines are as quiet as the American nuclear Navy. Is that, in your view, correct?
In certain circumstances, they are, and those circumstances would be, without getting into extremely classified information, let us say that in very close-in waters, particularly very shallow waters, the smaller diesel has some quieting advantages, but they are offset, Hugh, by the fact that our nukes, of course, can operate indefinitely underwater, whereas the diesel eventually has to find a path back to oxygen. So it's a trade-off. This is why we need allies who can operate diesels at extremely high ends of technology. For example, the Japanese, the Australians in the Pacific, the Germans in Europe. There are many nations who are, if you will, on our side who operate those capable diesels. And this is a good example of why alliances make sense. Not everybody has to have diesels. We bring the nukes. The Brits bring the nukes. The French bring the nukes, although the latter two have diesel capability as well. But let's have a two-speed alliance here in the sense that some of our allies can bring that high-end diesel capability. We bring the nukes. Pretty good marriage of operations in the Pacific.
Last question this week, Admiral. In the Kaplan book, there's quite a lot of murmuring about the Philippines. I'll just describe it that his confidence in the Philippines as a fighting force is low. His confidence in its stability as a sovereign country is not high. You've probably spent way too much time in the Philippines. What do you make of that? You know, I grew up on Magsaysay being sort of an idol of Richard Nixon's, but it doesn't seem like that's what we've got now.
The Philippines, first of all, has a very young population, somewhat like Vietnam. They have been intertwined with the United States, of course, for decades, going back to the period of time when we colonized it following the Spanish-American War. We have deep, abiding cultural, historical relationships with the Philippines. So that's the good news. The challenges in the Philippines are poverty, education, are more challenged, shall we say, than Vietnam across the South China Sea. The military capability, I'd say, is average for a nation of that size. And it is, and its political will at the moment is being driven by its president, President Duterte, who is someone who is, shall we say, mercurial. And one moment he's getting closer to China, the next he leans back toward the United States. I'll conclude by saying, on balance, I count the Philippines a strong ally, partner, and friend. And I am quite hopeful that they will ultimately lean in our direction, be with us. And everyone should recognize, by the way, we have a formal mutual defense treaty with the Philippines. Thus, an attack on them or an attack on their territories in the South China Sea is something to which we are required to respond. So it's a relationship we have to nurture. I think it's a good one. And I'll close by saying within the U.S. Navy, it's a particularly close relationship. There are many, many Filipino sailors who have been wonderful parts of the U.S. Navy going up into the ranks of the Admiralty.
Thank you so much, Admiral James Stavridis. Enjoy the game this weekend. Go Navy, beat Army.